In a world where darkness hides beneath the surface of normal life, where science can become a weapon more dangerous than any gun, and where the hunger for power can transform humans into monsters, there exists a story that changed horror forever. This is not just a tale of zombies and viral outbreaks. This is the chronicle of how ambition, greed, and the pursuit of immortality created nightmares that would haunt generations. Deep within the mountains of a quiet American town, in the shadowy corridors of a mansion that seemed peaceful from the outside, something terrifying was born. What started as a simple rescue mission would uncover secrets so dark, so twisted, that the world would never be the same. This is the complete story of Resident Evil, a saga of survival, betrayal, corporate evil, and the endless fight between humanity and the monsters we create. From the first drop of the T-virus to the global devastation that followed, from brave heroes who refused to give up to villains who believed they were gods. This journey will take you through every shadow, every scream, and every moment of terror that built a legacy of fear. Welcome to the Biohazard, where death is just the beginning. The story begins not with monsters, but with dreams. In the early 20th century, a brilliant scientist named Oswell E. Spencer gazed upon the world and saw weakness. He saw humanity struggling with disease, aging, and death itself. Spencer was not content to accept these limitations. He believed that science could overcome nature, that human evolution could be guided and controlled. Alongside his colleagues, Edward Ashford and James Marcus, Spencer founded the Umbrella Corporation in the late 1960s. To the public, Umbrella was a pharmaceutical company dedicated to improving human health. They produced medicines, medical equipment, and various health products that seemed beneficial to society. People trusted the Umbrella name. Parents gave their children Umbrella medications. Hospitals used Umbrella equipment. The red and white Umbrella logo became a symbol of care and progress. But beneath this friendly surface, something much darker was happening. Spencer and his partners were obsessed with something they called the progenitor virus, an ancient pathogen discovered in a rare flower in West Africa. This virus had remarkable properties. It could rewrite genetic code, alter living organisms, and push evolution in unexpected directions. Most people who encountered the progenitor virus died horrible deaths, but Spencer saw potential. He believed this virus could be refined, controlled, and weaponized. More importantly, he believed it could grant immortality and superhuman abilities to those worthy enough to receive it. The foundation of Umbrella was built on lies and hidden ambitions. While Spencer smiled for cameras and spoke about curing diseases, he was actually funding secret research into biological weapons. The company established hidden laboratories in remote locations where scientists worked on projects the world was never meant to know about. One of these facilities was built beneath a mansion in the Arkley Mountains, near a small town called Raccoon City. This location was chosen carefully. Raccoon City was a quiet, ordinary American town surrounded by forests and mountains. It was the perfect place to conduct experiments away from curious eyes. The people of Raccoon City had no idea that their peaceful home sat on top of a nightmare waiting to happen. Umbrella became deeply embedded in the town's economy, providing jobs and funding to local institutions. The Raccoon City Police Department received donations from Umbrella. The local hospital used Umbrella equipment. Schools received Umbrella scholarships for students. The company became so important to Raccoon City that questioning Umbrella felt like betraying the town itself. This was exactly what Spencer wanted. By making themselves essential, Umbrella could operate with minimal interference. The mayor, the police chief, and other officials were either ignorant of Umbrella's true nature or corrupted by money and influence. The stage was set for disaster. Inside the secret laboratories beneath the mansion and in other hidden Umbrella facilities, scientists worked tirelessly to modify the progenitor virus. Dr. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's founders, became obsessed with creating a virus that could be used for biological warfare. After years of experimentation involving various animal subjects, Marcus finally achieved a breakthrough. By combining the progenitor virus with leech DNA, he created what would be called the T-virus, with the T standing for tyrant. This new virus was incredibly contagious and had horrifying effects on living organisms. When humans were infected with the T-virus, Their bodies underwent rapid and terrible changes. The virus killed the host but then reanimated the corpse, creating what could only be described as a zombie. These creatures lost all higher brain functions and were driven by a single overwhelming urge: to feed on living flesh. The T-virus spread through bites, scratches, and bodily fluids, meaning that each zombie could create more zombies. An outbreak could theoretically spread exponentially, overwhelming any population center within days. But zombies were just the beginning. The T-virus affected different organisms in different ways. When dogs were infected, they became faster and more aggressive. When crows were infected, they gained increased size and hostility. Umbrella scientists deliberately infected various creatures to create biological weapons that could be deployed in warfare or sold to the highest bidder. One of Umbrella's most ambitious projects was the Tyrant program. The goal was to create a super soldier, a being that retained intelligence while gaining massive strength, durability, and combat effectiveness. However, creating a tyrant was extremely difficult. The T-virus usually destroyed higher brain functions, leaving only mindless aggression. Scientists discovered that only rare individuals with specific genetic traits could survive the transformation process and retain some degree of intelligence. These individuals were hard to find, and many experiments failed spectacularly, creating uncontrollable monsters instead of obedient soldiers. The tyrant prototypes were massive humanoid creatures with exposed hearts, huge claws, and incredible strength. They were powerful but often unstable and difficult to control. Despite these problems, Umbrella continued the Tyrant program, believing that perfecting this weapon would give them immense power and profit. The company's leadership, especially Spencer, viewed these creatures not as abominations but as products, as merchandise that could be sold to military organizations and governments around the world. Human life meant nothing to these people. Test subjects were often people who went missing, prisoners, or individuals from developing nations where Umbrella operated with impunity. The suffering inflicted in the name of progress was immeasurable. The mansion in the Arkley Mountains served as both a research facility and a training ground. Dr. Marcus used the nearby forest and the underground laboratory to conduct field tests of his creations. Infected animals were released into the woods to observe their behavior and survival rates. This meant that the forest around Raccoon City gradually became infested with dangerous creatures. Local residents began reporting strange incidents. Hikers went missing. Strange howls echoed through the trees at night. Mutilated animal corpses were found near trails. The Raccoon City Police Department received numerous reports of unusual activity, but these concerns were largely dismissed or downplayed by officials who were in Umbrella's pocket. However, as the incidents increased in frequency and severity, the police could no longer ignore the problem. The Special Tactics and Rescue Service, known as STARS, was Raccoon City's elite police unit. Comprised of highly trained officers with military backgrounds, STARS was responsible for handling dangerous situations that regular police could not manage. When people started disappearing in the Arkley Mountains and reports of attacks became more frequent, STARS was deployed to investigate. This decision would change everything. The men and women of STARS had no idea they were walking into a nightmare orchestrated by forces far beyond their understanding. On July 24, 1998, the STARS Bravo team helicopter experienced mechanical failure during their investigation flight over the Arkley Mountains and was forced to land in the forest. When Alpha Team arrived to search for their missing colleagues, they discovered the wreckage of Bravo Team's helicopter but no sign of the crew. As Alpha Team members searched the area, they were suddenly attacked by monstrous dogs unlike anything they had ever seen. These were Cerberus units, Dobermans infected with the T-virus. The creatures were rotting, aggressive, and terrifyingly fast. One STARS member was killed immediately. The survivors, including Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Weskier, and Barry Burton, fled through the forest and found themselves at the doorstep of a mansion. The building appeared to be an old estate, abandoned but strangely well-maintained. With no other option and monsters at their heels, the team entered the mansion seeking shelter. What they found inside would haunt them forever. The mansion was not abandoned. It was filled with the undead. Zombies wandered the hallways, former Umbrella employees, and test subjects who had been infected and killed by the T-virus. The mansion was also crawling with other biological weapons. Giant spiders, mutated plants called hunters, and worse things lurking in the shadows. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, depending on which path you follow in their journey, began exploring the mansion separately, trying to find survivors from Bravo Team and understand what had happened to this place. Every room held new horrors. The mansion was designed as a puzzle, with locked doors requiring specific keys or items to open. This was not by accident. The mansion had been built by Spencer himself decades earlier, designed with hidden passages, secret rooms, and elaborate security systems. It was both a residence and a fortress, a place where Spencer could conduct his dark business away from the world. As Chris and Jill explored deeper, they found documents and files that revealed the truth about Umbrella Corporation. They discovered research notes detailing experiments on human subjects. They found evidence of the T-virus and its effects. They learned that this mansion was just one facility in a vast network of secret laboratories. The scope of Umbrella's crimes was staggering. These were not accidents or mistakes. This was deliberate bioweapon development conducted by a corporation that valued profit over human life. The STARS members also encountered survivors from Bravo Team, including Rebecca Chambers, a young medic, and Richard Aiken, though Richard would not survive long. The mansion seemed designed to kill anyone who entered, with traps and monsters around every corner. The deeper they went, the more they uncovered about the facility beneath the mansion. The estate was merely the entrance to a much larger underground complex where the real research took place. In the subterranean laboratory, Umbrella scientists had created abominations that defied nature. The hunters were particularly terrifying. Reptilian creatures with incredible speed and sharp claws that could decapitate a person with a single swipe. These were intelligent predators, capable of stalking prey and working in groups. Umbrella had refined the T-virus to the point where they could create custom bioweapons for specific purposes. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when the STARS members discovered the betrayal within their own ranks. Captain Albert Weskier, the leader of STARS Alpha Team, was secretly working for Umbrella. Weskier had been planted in the police department to monitor any investigations that might threaten Umbrella's operations. The entire mission to the mansion was a setup. Weskier had arranged for STARS to be sent to the mansion specifically to test the bioweapons on trained combat personnel. STARS members were guinea pigs in an experiment, their deaths meant to provide data on how effective Umbrella's creatures were against skilled soldiers. Weskier's betrayal was personal and devastating. These were people he had worked alongside, trained with, and claimed to protect. Yet he was willing to sacrifice them all for Umbrella's goals and his own ambition. The confrontation with Weskier revealed even more. In the depths of the laboratory, Umbrella had created a tyrant, a massive bioweapon that represented years of research. Weskier released the tyrant to eliminate the surviving STARS members. But the creature was not as controllable as Weskier believed. The tyrant attacked everyone, including Weskier himself. In a moment of poetic justice, Weskier was impaled by the very monster he had unleashed. However, this was not the end of Albert Weskier's story, though the STARS survivors did not know this at the time. The final battle against the tyrant was desperate and brutal. Chris and Jill, along with any remaining survivors, had to use every weapon and resource they could find to fight the monster. The tyrant was incredibly resilient, able to withstand gunfire that would kill a normal person many times over. Only through coordinated attacks and the use of heavy weapons could the creature finally be defeated. But defeating the tyrant was not the end of their ordeal. The laboratory's self-destruct system had been activated, likely as a failsafe to destroy evidence of Umbrella's crimes. The mansion and the entire underground facility were set to explode. The STARS survivors had to race against time, navigating through collapsing tunnels and past remaining monsters to reach the surface. Behind them, the mansion erupted in a massive explosion, consuming all the horrors within. The survivors escaped by helicopter just as the entire facility was destroyed. They had survived, but they were forever changed by what they had witnessed. When Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and the other STARS survivors returned to Raccoon City, they expected to be believed. They had evidence, testimonies, and first-hand experience of Umbrella's crimes. They immediately reported to their superiors in the Raccoon City Police Department, detailing everything they had seen: the bioweapons, the zombies, the underground laboratory, and Weskier's betrayal. However, instead of launching an investigation into Umbrella Corporation, the police department dismissed their claims. Chief Brian Irons, the head of the Raccoon City Police Department, was on Umbrella's payroll. He had been receiving bribes for years to overlook Umbrella's activities and suppress any investigations into the company. Irons declared the STARS report to be unreliable, claiming the survivors were traumatized and imagining things. He suggested that the deaths of STARS members in the mountains were due to wild animals and accidents, nothing more. The official story was that the mansion incident was a tragedy caused by natural causes, not corporate malfeasance. The mainstream media, influenced by Umbrella's public relations machine and advertising money, did not pursue the story. Umbrella Corporation issued statements expressing sympathy for the lost officers while denying any involvement in illegal activities. To the general public, Umbrella remained a respected pharmaceutical company. Chris and Jill refused to accept this cover-up. They knew the truth, and they knew that Umbrella was still operating and still creating bioweapons. If nothing was done, more innocent people would die. The STARS survivors began gathering evidence on their own, trying to build a case strong enough that it could not be ignored. They investigated Umbrella's business dealings, tracked shipments from Umbrella facilities, and tried to identify other secret laboratories. This was dangerous work. Umbrella had vast resources and was willing to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. Chris and Jill also reached out to contacts outside Raccoon City, trying to warn the federal government and other authorities about Umbrella's activities. Some people listened, but bureaucracy and Umbrella's political connections made it difficult to take action. Umbrella had friends in high places. They had donated to politicians, funded government research programs, and positioned themselves as essential to national security by offering their bioweapon technology to military organizations. Exposing Umbrella was not just about revealing corporate crimes. It was about challenging a system where money and power could protect even the most monstrous actions. The STARS survivors found themselves isolated and frustrated. They had risked their lives, lost friends, and uncovered a conspiracy, yet they were treated as troublemakers spreading conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, Umbrella continued its research. The mansion incident had been a setback, but it was not a fatal blow to the corporation. Umbrella had multiple facilities around the world, and the data collected from the mansion experiments, including the performance of bioweapons against STARS, was valuable. The company adapted and moved forward, always staying one step ahead of investigators. However, cracks were beginning to show. Within Umbrella itself, different factions were competing for power and influence. Dr. William Birkin, a brilliant but morally bankrupt scientist, had been conducting his own research at a facility beneath Raccoon City. Birkin had created a new virus called the G-virus, which was even more powerful and dangerous than the T-virus. The G-virus could transform hosts into incredibly powerful creatures with regenerative abilities and the capacity to implant embryos in other humans, creating more G-virus monsters. Birkin believed the G-virus was his ticket to greatness within Umbrella and beyond. He saw himself as a genius whose work would change the world. However, Umbrella's leadership had other ideas. They wanted to take Birkin's research and integrate it into their bioweapon programs, but Birkin was becoming uncooperative and possessive of his work. Tensions rose as Birkin considered selling the G-virus to outside organizations, which would be a betrayal of Umbrella. The situation reached a breaking point when Umbrella sent a special forces team to Birkin's laboratory to seize the G-virus samples by force. Birkin resisted, resulting in a confrontation that left the scientist mortally wounded. In his dying moments, Birkin injected himself with the G-virus, hoping it would save his life. Instead, it transformed him into a grotesque monster driven by rage and instinct. The mutated Birkin attacked the Umbrella soldiers, killing them and causing chaos in the laboratory. During the battle, the T-virus samples stored in the lab were destroyed, and the virus was released into Raccoon City's water supply through the sewer system. Rats in the sewers became infected and spread the virus throughout the city. Within days, Raccoon City was experiencing a zombie outbreak. People began getting sick with flu-like symptoms, then dying and reanimating as zombies. The infection spread quickly through the population. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The police tried to maintain order, but they were unprepared for the scale of the crisis. As more people turned into zombies, the city descended into chaos. The streets filled with the undead, attacking anyone they encountered. Survivors barricaded themselves in buildings, hoping for rescue that did not come. The government and Umbrella both knew what was happening, but instead of helping the citizens of Raccoon City, they focused on containing the outbreak and covering up the truth. As the T-virus spread through Raccoon City in September 1998, the situation rapidly deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. The city's population of 100,000 people found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Zombies filled the streets, hospitals, schools, and homes. The Raccoon City Police Department tried to mount a defense, but they were overwhelmed. Officers who had trained for shootouts and hostage situations found themselves facing endless waves of undead citizens. Ammunition ran low. Officers were bitten and became infected themselves. The police station, which should have been a safe haven, became a fortress under siege. Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie cop arriving for his first day on the job, drove into Raccoon City expecting to start his law enforcement career. Instead, he found a city overrun by zombies. Simultaneously, Claire Redfield, the younger sister of Chris Redfield, arrived in Raccoon City looking for her brother, unaware that Chris had left town to investigate Umbrella. Both Leon and Claire were thrust into a fight for survival from the moment they arrived. They met briefly during a chaotic encounter with zombies and a car accident, then became separated, each facing their own harrowing journey through the dying city. Leon made his way to the Raccoon City Police Department, hoping to find other officers and organize a response. The police station was a grand old building that had once been a museum, with elaborate architecture and confusing layout. Inside, Leon found a scene of horror. Dead officers littered the hallways. Zombies wandered through rooms that should have been safe. Survivors were scattered and isolated, trapped in different parts of the building. Leon met Ada Wong, a mysterious woman who claimed to be searching for her boyfriend, an Umbrella researcher. Ada was secretive and skilled in combat, far more capable than a civilian should be. Leon was immediately drawn to her, beginning a complicated relationship built on attraction and distrust. Together, Leon and Ada navigated the police station, solving puzzles and fighting through hordes of zombies. They discovered that Chief Irons, the corrupt police chief, had completely lost his mind. Rather than helping his officers or the citizens, Irons had gone insane, kidnapping and murdering people in his private office. The revelation that the man responsible for the city's safety was a homicidal madman added another layer of horror to an already impossible situation. Leon also encountered the Lickers, evolved zombies that had lost their skin and developed enhanced hearing and long, deadly tongues. These creatures were even more dangerous than regular zombies, fast and aggressive. Claire Redfield's journey took her to the Raccoon City Police Department as well, though she and Leon remained mostly separated, their paths crossing occasionally. Claire met a young girl named Sherry Birkin, the daughter of Dr. William Birkin, the scientist who had created the G-virus. Sherry was alone, scared, and trying to survive in a city that wanted to eat her. Claire immediately took on the role of protector, determined to keep Sherry safe no matter what. However, Sherry was carrying something that made her a target. Her father, now a mutated monster, was instinctively seeking her out. The G-virus creature that had been William Birkin retained some primal drive to reproduce, and it saw Sherry as a host for the virus. Throughout their escape from Raccoon City, Claire and Sherry were stalked by the Birkin creature, which kept evolving and becoming more dangerous with each encounter. Claire also crossed paths with Ada Wong and learned that Ada was not who she claimed to be. Ada was actually a spy working for a rival organization, trying to steal the G-virus for her employers. Despite her deceptions, Ada showed moments of genuine humanity, particularly in her interactions with Leon. The complex web of lies, survival, and unexpected alliances made the nightmare even more unpredictable. As Leon and Claire fought through the city, they discovered Umbrella's underground research facility, a massive complex beneath Raccoon City where Dr. Birkin had conducted his experiments. This facility was the source of the outbreak, and it held the secrets of the G-virus. The laboratory was a maze of high-tech security, failed experiments, and dangerous bioweapons. Deep in the facility, they encountered the mutated William Birkin multiple times. Each battle was more difficult than the last as Birkin evolved into increasingly monstrous forms, growing in size and power. The creature was nearly unstoppable, regenerating from wounds and developing new abilities. The fight against Birkin was not just about defeating a monster. It was about stopping the G-virus from spreading beyond Raccoon City. Leon also discovered the truth about Ada. During a confrontation with the mutated Birkin, Ada was apparently killed trying to help Leon, falling into a chasm after being injured. Leon was devastated, believing he had lost someone who had become important to him despite her lies. However, Ada's fate was more complicated than it appeared, though Leon would not learn this until much later. The emotional toll of the outbreak was immense. Survivors had to make impossible choices, leaving people behind to save themselves, and questioning whether survival was even worth the cost. Claire managed to protect Sherry, even when the young girl became infected with the G-virus. Unlike most hosts, Sherry's body adapted to the virus, giving her regenerative abilities without transforming her into a monster. This made Sherry incredibly valuable to anyone interested in the G-virus, which meant she would never be truly safe as long as organizations like Umbrella existed. In the depths of the underground laboratory, Claire faced the fully mutated William Birkin in a final desperate battle. The creature had become a massive, barely recognizable abomination, but Claire managed to defeat it, ending the immediate threat. As Leon and Claire separately made their way out of the underground facility, they learned that the United States government had made a decision. Raccoon City was considered lost, and the outbreak was deemed too dangerous to contain through conventional means. The government had authorized a missile strike on the city to completely eliminate the biohazard. Leon and Claire had only hours to escape before the entire city would be destroyed. Racing against time, fighting through remaining zombies and bioweapons, they made their way to the surface and fled the city. Some survivors managed to escape Raccoon City before the missile hit, but most of the population perished, either killed by zombies, bioweapons, or the destruction itself. On October 1, 1998, Raccoon City was obliterated by a nuclear weapon, erasing the city and everyone in it from existence. The official story was a cover-up, blaming the destruction on a nuclear accident at a nearby facility rather than admitting the truth about Umbrella's bioweapons. The destruction of Raccoon City sent shockwaves through the world, even if the true cause was hidden behind lies and misdirection. Survivors like Leon, Claire, and Sherry knew the truth. They had witnessed Umbrella's crimes firsthand and lost people they cared about to the company's negligence and greed. These survivors became determined to expose Umbrella and ensure that nothing like Raccoon City could happen again. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, who had survived the mansion incident months earlier, joined with Leon, Claire, and others to form a united front against Umbrella. They gathered evidence, testimonies, and documentation of Umbrella's illegal bioweapon research. They contacted journalists, politicians, and international authorities, gradually building a case that could not be dismissed or buried. The survivors also learned that Albert Weskier, their former captain who they believed had died in the mansion incident, was actually alive. Weskier had injected himself with an experimental virus before his apparent death, which gave him superhuman abilities including enhanced strength, speed, and regeneration. Weskier had survived the Tyrant attack and the mansion explosion, and he was now working with various organizations in the shadows, pursuing his own agenda to obtain bioweapon data and virus samples. Weskier's survival and transformation added a personal enemy to the survivors' fight, someone who knew them and was always one step ahead. As evidence of Umbrella's crimes accumulated and more incidents came to light, the corporation's power began to crumble. International authorities launched investigations. Stock prices plummeted. Umbrella facilities around the world were raided by military and police forces. The company that had seemed invincible was finally facing consequences. However, bringing down Umbrella was not simple. The corporation had allies, hidden assets, and backup plans. Even as the main company collapsed, splinter groups and former employees took virus samples and research data to start their own organizations or sell to the highest bidder. The bioweapon threat did not end with Umbrella's fall. It metastasized, spreading to multiple groups and making the problem even harder to combat. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine joined a new organization called the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, known as BSAA. This international group was dedicated to combating bioterrorism and stopping the proliferation of bioweapons. The BSAA operated globally, responding to outbreaks and bioweapon incidents wherever they occurred. It was humanity's attempt to create a defense against the monsters that corporations like Umbrella had unleashed. Leon S. Kennedy's path took a different direction. His actions during the Raccoon City incident caught the attention of the United States government. Rather than being allowed to simply walk away, Leon was recruited into a special government program. He was trained as an elite agent and assigned to missions involving bioterrorism and national security threats. The government also took custody of Sherry Birkin, using her as a test subject to study the G-virus effects in her body, though they claimed she was being protected. Leon's recruitment was presented as a choice, but it was made clear that refusal would result in consequences for both him and Sherry. Leon became a government agent, but he never forgot why he was fighting. Every mission was driven by the memory of Raccoon City and the desire to prevent similar tragedies. Claire Redfield chose a different path entirely. She joined an organization called TerraSave, a non-governmental group that provided humanitarian aid to victims of bioterrorism. While her brother Chris fought bioweapons directly, Claire focused on helping the survivors, the people whose lives were destroyed by outbreaks and attacks. Both approaches were necessary, and the Redfield siblings remained close despite their different methods. The early 2000s saw numerous bioterrorism incidents around the world. In a remote village in Spain, Leon Kennedy was sent to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, who had been kidnapped by a mysterious cult. Leon discovered that the village was infected with Las Plagas, a parasitic organism that was different from the T-virus but equally dangerous. Las Plagas took control of hosts' bodies, allowing a hive mind to direct their actions. This meant infected villagers could coordinate, use weapons, and set traps, making them far more dangerous than mindless zombies. The cult, called Los Illuminados, was led by a fanatic named Osmond Sadler who planned to use Las Plagas to take over the world. Leon also encountered Ada Wong again, learning that she had survived their encounter in Raccoon City. Ada was working for a mysterious organization called the Organization, stealing bioweapon samples and data for her employers. Despite being on opposite sides, Leon and Ada maintained their complicated relationship, helping each other at crucial moments while ultimately serving different masters. Leon's mission in Spain was a nightmare of survival and combat, facing not only Las Plagas-infected villagers, but also enhanced bioweapons created by combining Umbrella's research with the parasites. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine continued their work with the BSAA, tracking down remaining Umbrella facilities and bioweapon stockpiles. They traveled to Europe, Africa, and other continents, facing various bioterrorism threats. In one mission, they confronted Albert Weskier directly. Weskier had become involved with a rival organization and was working to create a new bioweapon using advanced virus research. The confrontation with Weskier was personal and dangerous. Weskier's superhuman abilities made him nearly impossible to fight directly. During this encounter, Weskier captured Jill Valentine, and Chris believed she had been killed. The loss devastated Chris, who blamed himself for not protecting his partner. However, Jill was not dead. Weskier had injected her with a virus that gave him control over her mind and body, turning her into his puppet. For years, Jill was forced to serve Weskier, her mind trapped while her body followed his commands. This period was a dark time for the heroes who had survived so much. They were winning battles but not the war. For every bioweapon facility shut down, another opened somewhere else. For every virus sample destroyed, another was sold on the black market. Albert Weskier's ultimate plan was revealed in Africa, where he had established a base of operations and was preparing to release a virus called Ouroboros on the global population. Weskier's philosophy had evolved from simple greed and ambition into a twisted belief that humanity needed to be forcibly evolved. He saw most humans as inferior beings destined for extinction, and he believed that only the strong, those who could survive viral infection and transformation, deserved to inherit the Earth. Ouroboros was his tool for this mass extinction and forced evolution. The virus would spread rapidly, killing billions and transforming a select few into superhuman beings. Weskier saw himself as a god, the architect of a new world order. Chris Redfield was deployed to Africa with a new partner, Shiva Alomar, a BSAA agent with personal connections to the region. They investigated reports of bioweapon activity and discovered the scope of Weskier's plan. The African mission took them through villages, research facilities, and underground complexes, all while fighting against the Majini, locals infected with Las Plagas parasites. The situation was complicated by the involvement of Tricell, a pharmaceutical company that had filled the void left by Umbrella's collapse and was secretly supporting Weskier's research. During the mission, Chris and Shiva discovered that Jill Valentine was alive but under Weskier's control. Confronting Jill was heart-wrenching for Chris, who had to fight his former partner while trying not to hurt her. Through determination and Shiva's help, they managed to remove the device Weskier was using to control Jill, freeing her from his influence. Jill's liberation was an emotional victory, proving that even in the darkest situations, hope remained. However, the virus experiments had changed Jill, giving her enhanced physical abilities but also traumatic memories of the things she had been forced to do while under Weskier's control. With Jill freed, Chris and Shiva pursued Weskier to stop the Ouroboros release. Weskier had already injected himself with the virus, transforming into a powerful and grotesque creature. The final battle against Weskier was an epic confrontation that tested Chris and Shiva to their limits. Weskier's speed, strength, and regenerative abilities made him seem invincible. The fight took them through collapsing facilities and onto military hardware, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. Chris channeled all his rage, grief, and determination into this fight, remembering everyone who had died because of Umbrella and bioweapons. In the end, Weskier was defeated not by strength alone but by teamwork and sacrifice. Chris and Shiva worked together perfectly, covering each other's weaknesses and exploiting Weskier's overconfidence. When Weskier was finally vulnerable, they used every weapon available to ensure he could not regenerate or escape. Albert Weskier, the man who had caused so much pain and death, who had betrayed his colleagues and tried to reshape the world, was killed in a volcanic eruption, his body consumed by lava. His death marked the end of an era. The original villain of the Resident Evil saga was gone, and with him went many secrets of the early bioweapon research. However, the threat was far from over. Weskier's research, his virus samples, and his ideas had spread throughout the world. Other individuals and organizations had taken up the bioweapon trade, each with their own motivations and goals. The BSAA continued its work, responding to incidents and trying to prevent global catastrophes. Chris Redfield remained one of their top agents, but the years of fighting had taken a toll. He had lost friends, seen countless horrors, and carried the weight of survival guilt. Yet he continued because someone had to stand against the darkness. The world of bioterrorism evolved as new players entered the scene. In Eastern Europe, a country was torn apart by civil war and bioweapon attacks. Leon Kennedy was sent to investigate and found himself in a conflict where all sides were using bioweapons as tools of war. The situation was morally complex, with no clear heroes or villains, just desperate people making terrible choices. This mission challenged Leon's worldview and forced him to confront the reality that bioweapons were becoming normalized, viewed as just another weapon in humanity's arsenal. In Asia, bioterrorism incidents occurred with increasing frequency. Claire Redfield's humanitarian organization responded to these crises, providing aid to survivors and documenting the impact of bioweapons on civilian populations. Claire witnessed the human cost of these attacks, the families destroyed, the communities shattered, and the psychological trauma that survivors carried. Her work was less glamorous than her brother's battles, but equally important. Someone needed to remind the world that behind every outbreak statistic was a real person with hopes and dreams. A significant incident occurred on a luxury cruise ship where a bioterrorism attack turned passengers into zombies. The incident revealed how vulnerable civilian populations were to these attacks and how easily a single infected person or deliberate release could cause mass casualties. The cruise ship incident also showed how bioterrorism was evolving. Attackers were becoming more sophisticated, using viruses strategically to achieve political or economic goals rather than simple chaos. This made the threat harder to combat because it required not just military response but intelligence work, diplomacy, and international cooperation. The BSAA expanded its operations, establishing bases around the world and coordinating with national governments. However, this expansion came with challenges. Not all countries wanted foreign intervention, even when facing bioweapon threats. Some nations were secretly developing their own bioweapons, seeing them as necessary for national defense. The line between protecting people and violating sovereignty was often blurred. In the United States, the government faced its own bioterrorism incident when a new virus outbreak occurred in a major city. Leon Kennedy responded alongside Helena Harper, a government agent with her own connection to the incident. They discovered that the attack was politically motivated, designed to assassinate the president and destabilize the government. The president had been planning to reveal the truth about Raccoon City and the government's role in covering up Umbrella's crimes. His assassination showed that powerful forces were still willing to use bioweapons to protect their interests. Leon's investigation revealed a conspiracy that went deep into the government, with officials who had supported or profited from bioweapon research now desperate to keep their crimes hidden. Chris Redfield was deployed to China during the same time frame, investigating a series of bioterrorism attacks there. He worked with a new BSAA team, but his leadership was tested when members of his squad were killed in an ambush. Chris suffered temporary amnesia from the trauma, forgetting months of his life. When he recovered, he was consumed by guilt over the deaths of his team members. The experience pushed Chris to the edge, making him question whether he could continue fighting. These simultaneous global incidents revealed a coordinated bioterrorism campaign orchestrated by a secret organization called Neo Umbrella. This group was formed by former Umbrella researchers and employees who had escaped justice and wanted to rebuild their dark empire. Neo Umbrella had access to decades of bioweapon research and the financial backing of powerful individuals who believed in the profit potential of biological warfare. The organization's leader was a woman named Carla Radames, a scientist who had been transformed into a doppelganger of Ada Wong through experimental procedures. Carla's story was tragic. She had been a brilliant researcher who was betrayed and subjected to horrific experiments that destroyed her original identity. Driven by madness and revenge, Carla used Neo Umbrella to strike at the world, creating chaos and destruction. The complexity of the conspiracy meant that Chris, Leon, and other agents had to coordinate their efforts, sharing intelligence and resources across continents. Ada Wong, the real one, also became involved, working to stop Carla and clear her name. The various storylines intersected in China, where a final confrontation occurred. Chris and Leon briefly found themselves at odds due to misunderstandings and conflicting information, but they ultimately united against the common enemy. Despite the defeat of Neo Umbrella and other organizations, bioterrorism remained a persistent threat. In South America, a bioweapon incident occurred at a research facility where a new virus called the Tiabis was being studied. This virus could infect both land and aquatic creatures, creating new types of bioweapons that could attack from the water. The incident showed that virus research was still ongoing, with new strains and variants being developed constantly. Each new virus had different properties, requiring different countermeasures and responses. Jill Valentine and Parker Luciani, BSAA agents, were sent to investigate a derelict ship where the Tiabis virus had been deployed. The ship was a floating nightmare, filled with mutated creatures and traps. The investigation revealed that the incident was part of a conspiracy within the BSAA itself, with a high-ranking official secretly supporting bioweapon development for profit. This betrayal from within was demoralizing, showing that even organizations dedicated to fighting bioterrorism could be corrupted. The incident was resolved, but it left scars and raised questions about trust and loyalty. In a remote village, bioweapon researchers conducted experiments on the local population, treating people as test subjects without consent. When the experiments inevitably went wrong, the village became ground zero for an outbreak. The incident remained hidden for years until survivors emerged and told their stories. The revelation sparked international outrage and renewed calls for stronger regulations on biological research. However, enforcement remained a problem. Bioweapon research could be conducted in secret with relatively limited resources, making it difficult to monitor and prevent. The black market for virus samples and bioweapon data thrived, with buyers ranging from terrorist groups to legitimate governments. The technology had spread too far to contain completely. Claire Redfield and her organization TerraSave worked tirelessly to help survivors of bioterrorism, but the psychological damage was often as severe as the physical injuries. Survivors struggled with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the fear that another outbreak could happen at any time. Communities affected by bioterrorism never fully recovered. The economic impact, the loss of population, and the stigma associated with infection zones created lasting damage. In Europe, a new incident occurred when a terrorist group attacked a city with an airborne virus variant that spread rapidly through the population. The BSAA responded, but containment was difficult due to the virus's transmission method. Thousands were infected before the outbreak could be controlled. The incident demonstrated that bioweapons were becoming more sophisticated and harder to defend against. Scientists in the BSAA and other organizations worked on developing vaccines and antidotes for known viruses, but the research was always playing catch-up. By the time a vaccine was developed for one virus, terrorists and rogue scientists had created new variants that rendered the vaccine ineffective. Chris Redfield continued his work despite the mounting toll. He had aged, his face lined with stress and his body carrying injuries from countless battles. Younger agents looked up to him as a legend, but Chris saw himself as a soldier who had simply survived when others had not. He trained new BSAA recruits, trying to prepare them for the horrors they would face while knowing that no amount of training could truly prepare someone for confronting bioweapons. Jill Valentine also remained active, though she worked more from behind the scenes, coordinating missions and providing intelligence. The virus experiments that Weskier had subjected her to had long-term effects on her body, and she was more cautious about field deployment. Leon Kennedy rose through the ranks of government service, becoming one of the most trusted agents in bioterrorism response. He advised presidents, led special operations, and mentored younger agents. However, the work was isolating. Leon could not maintain normal relationships when his life involved constant danger and secrets he could not share. His connection with Ada Wong remained complicated. They encountered each other periodically over the years, sometimes as allies and sometimes as opponents, but always with unresolved feelings between them. Ada remained an enigma, working for whoever paid her while occasionally helping Leon when it suited her purposes. Her true loyalties were unclear, and Leon was never sure if what they had was real or just a convenient fiction. The emotional complexity added depth to Leon's character, showing that being a hero came with personal costs. Claire Redfield maintained her humanitarian work, and her efforts saved countless lives. She documented the impact of bioterrorism comprehensively, creating archives that ensured the victims would not be forgotten. Claire's work also included advocacy, pushing for international laws and treaties to ban bioweapon research and hold perpetrators accountable. Progress was slow, with nations reluctant to give up potential military advantages, but Claire's persistence gradually changed attitudes. The story of Resident Evil expanded to explore the origins of bioweapon research more deeply. It was revealed that the bioweapon conspiracy stretched back further than anyone had realized. Before Umbrella Corporation, before Spencer, there were others who had experimented with viruses and biological manipulation. In Eastern Europe, a village called the Castle Dimitrescu region held dark secrets dating back centuries. Ancient aristocratic families had used parasites and viral infections to extend their lives and gain power, creating proto-bioweapons long before modern science gave names to these phenomena. Ethan Winters, an ordinary civilian, became entangled in this dark legacy when his wife Mia disappeared. Ethan traveled to a derelict plantation in Louisiana to find her, only to discover that she had been infected with a bioweapon and was being held by the Baker family. The Bakers were a kind family who had been infected by a mysterious young girl named Eveline, a bioweapon created to be the ultimate infiltration tool. Eveline could control infected individuals telepathically, creating a network of puppets. The Baker family became Eveline's unwilling servants, committing atrocities while their true selves remained trapped inside, aware but helpless. Ethan's journey through the Baker plantation was a descent into madness. The family members had been transformed into grotesque, nearly indestructible creatures. Jack Baker, the family patriarch, could regenerate from injuries that should have been fatal. Marguerite Baker had been transformed into something insect-like, able to control bugs and mutate further when threatened. Lucas Baker, the son, retained his intelligence but became sadistic, creating elaborate death traps for victims. Ethan was not a trained soldier or experienced agent. He was an ordinary person forced to do extraordinary things to save his wife. His determination and love drove him forward despite fear and pain. Ethan suffered horrific injuries during his ordeal, including having his hand cut off, yet he continued fighting. The Baker plantation incident revealed that bioweapon research had never truly stopped after Umbrella's fall. Various organizations continued developing new viruses and creatures, each believing they could control what Umbrella could not. Eveline was a product of this continued research, created by a corporation called The Connections. When Ethan finally confronted Eveline, he learned that she was a deeply tragic figure. She had been created in a laboratory and aged rapidly, giving her the mind of a child in a deteriorating body. Eveline wanted a family, so she created one by infecting the Bakers. Her actions were monstrous, but they came from a place of loneliness and confusion. Ethan managed to rescue Mia and destroy Eveline with the help of Redfield, who appeared at the end to extract them. However, the rescue was not the end of their story. Ethan and Mia tried to rebuild their lives, to have a normal existence despite the trauma they had endured. They had a daughter named Rosemary and moved to a remote location in Europe, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the darkness followed them. Chris Redfield appeared at their home and apparently murdered Mia in front of Ethan, then kidnapped Rosemary. Ethan was devastated and confused. Chris was supposed to be a hero, yet he had destroyed Ethan's family. The truth was more complicated. The woman Chris killed was not Mia but another bioweapon impersonating her. Rosemary had been kidnapped by a cult called the Four Lords, operating under the command of Mother Miranda, an ancient scientist who had discovered the mold, a fungal organism with virus-like properties. Mother Miranda had been conducting experiments for over a century, trying to resurrect her dead daughter. She believed Rosemary, who had been born with mold infection from Mia, could serve as the perfect vessel for her daughter's rebirth. Ethan's journey to rescue Rosemary took him to a remote European village controlled by Mother Miranda and the Four Lords. Each lord was a powerful bioweapon created through mold infection. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu was a towering vampire-like aristocrat who ruled a castle with her daughters. Donna Beneviento was a dollmaker who could induce hallucinations and control puppet weapons. Salvatore Moreau was a pitiable creature who desperately sought Miranda's approval despite his grotesque transformation. Carl Heisenberg was a brilliant engineer who could control metal and had created an army of cybernetic monsters. Each lord represented a different type of horror, and Ethan had to defeat them all to reach his daughter. The village and its surroundings were a place frozen in time, where ancient evil and modern bioweapon science merged. Ethan's determination never wavered despite facing enemies far beyond his abilities. He was not superhuman, not specially trained, just a father who would do anything to save his child. During his journey, Ethan discovered that he himself had died back in the Baker plantation incident. When Eveline attacked him, she had inflicted fatal injuries, but the mold infection in his body had reanimated him. For years, Ethan had been something similar to the creatures he fought against, held together by the mold while his consciousness remained intact. This revelation reframed Ethan's entire experience, explaining how he survived injuries that should have killed him. The confrontation with Mother Miranda was the culmination of over a century of bioweapon horror. Miranda was not motivated by greed or power like Spencer and other villains. She was driven by grief and love for her deceased daughter, twisted into something monstrous by time and experimentation. Miranda had been the mentor to Oswald Spencer, teaching him about the mold and viral research before he founded Umbrella. In a sense, All the horror of Resident Evil traced back to this one woman's inability to accept loss. The battle against Miranda pushed Ethan beyond his limits. His body, held together by the mold, was deteriorating rapidly. Miranda was incredibly powerful, able to shapeshift, regenerate, and manipulate the environment. The fight was desperate, with Ethan knowing that even if he won, he was dying. Chris Redfield and his team arrived to assist, but it was Ethan who delivered the final blow to Miranda, saving Rosemary and ending the immediate threat. However, there was no happy ending for Ethan. His body was failing, and the entire region was rigged to explode to destroy the mold contamination. Ethan made the decision to stay behind, to sacrifice himself to ensure Rosemary and the others could escape. In his final moments, Ethan was just a father protecting his daughter, accepting his death with the knowledge that she would live. Chris Redfield took Rosemary and raised her with support from various organizations that wanted to study her unique biology. Rosemary grew up knowing she was different, infected with the mold from birth but able to control it in ways others could not. She struggled with her identity, wondering if she was human or monster, belonging nowhere completely. As a teenager, Rose entered a virtual world created from the mold's collective consciousness to undergo a procedure that might eliminate her powers. She believed becoming normal would solve her problems and allow her to live a regular life. Inside this virtual world, Rose experienced fragments of her father's memories and encountered aspects of the mold that took on personalities and forms. She learned about her father's sacrifice, about his love for her, and about the courage that drove him to face impossible odds. Rose also confronted the reality that her powers, while making her different, were part of who she was. Removing them would not solve her identity crisis but only create different problems. Through this journey, Rose gained acceptance of herself and appreciation for what her father had done. The Resident Evil story had come full circle. What began with scientists playing God, trying to control evolution and create bioweapons, had led to countless deaths and suffering. Corporations had risen and fallen. Heroes had fought for decades against an enemy that kept changing forms but never truly disappeared. The tragedy of Ethan Winters showed that anyone could become entangled in the bioweapon conspiracy, that ordinary people could become heroes through love and determination, and that sacrifice was sometimes necessary to protect what mattered most. Chris Redfield, now much older and bearing the scars of decades of fighting, continued his work with the BSAA. However, he discovered that even the BSAA had been compromised. The organization was using bioweapon soldiers, reprogrammed humanoid creatures, arguing that it was necessary to fight fire with fire. Chris was disgusted by this development. The BSAA had been founded to eliminate bioweapons, not to use them. The revelation that his own organization had become what he fought against was a devastating blow. Chris began working outside official channels, forming his own team to combat bioterrorism without the moral compromises that had infected larger organizations. The reality of the Resident Evil universe is that the fight against bioweapons is never truly over. Each generation faces new threats as technology advances and more individuals gain access to dangerous research. The black market for virus samples remains active, with buyers ranging from terrorist organizations to nations seeking military advantages. Scientists who believe they can control bioweapons continue experimenting, ignoring the lessons of history. The hubris that created Umbrella Corporation has not disappeared. It has merely changed names and locations. Leon Kennedy, now a veteran agent with decades of experience, took on fewer field missions and focused more on training and strategic planning. He knew he could not fight forever, and preparing the next generation became his priority. Leon's relationship with Ada Wong remained unresolved. They continued encountering each other over the years, their interactions marked by attraction, distrust, and mutual respect. Ada remained an independent operator, working for whoever paid her while occasionally helping Leon when their goals aligned. Whether she had genuine feelings for Leon or simply found him useful was a question without a clear answer. Ada's moral ambiguity made her one of the most complex characters in the saga, neither hero nor villain but something in between. Claire Redfield's humanitarian work expanded globally, with TerraSave becoming a major international organization. Claire documented the stories of bioterrorism survivors, ensuring their experiences were recorded and remembered. She advocated for victims' rights and pushed for international cooperation on bioweapon prevention. Claire's work was less dramatic than military operations but equally important. She represented the human side of the story, the lives destroyed by outbreaks and the communities struggling to rebuild. Claire also maintained a close relationship with her brother Chris, though they did not always agree on methods. Chris believed in direct action and military response, while Claire prioritized humanitarian aid and systemic change. Both approaches were necessary, and the Redfield siblings respected each other's choices while pursuing their own paths. Jill Valentine, who had suffered so much over the years, found some measure of peace. She continued working with the BSAA in advisory and coordination roles, using her experience to guide operations and train agents. The virus experiments that Weskier subjected her to had permanent effects, but Jill had learned to live with the changes. She represented resilience, the ability to survive trauma and continue fighting despite the scars. Sherry Birkin, who had been a child during the Raccoon City incident, grew up in government custody and eventually became an agent herself. Her body's adaptation to the G-virus gave her enhanced healing and resistance to infection, making her valuable for dangerous missions. Sherry worked to protect others from experiencing what she had gone through as a child. Her story showed that survivors could reclaim their lives and turn trauma into strength. However, Sherry also struggled with being treated as a test subject and weapon rather than a person. The government's interest in her was primarily scientific and tactical, not personal. Jake Muller, the son of Albert Weskier, discovered his father's identity years after Weskier's death. Jake had inherited some of Weskier's enhanced abilities, making his blood valuable for developing vaccines and treatments. Jake initially wanted nothing to do with his father's legacy, but circumstances forced him into the world of bioterrorism. Working alongside Sherry Birkin, Jake learned about the damage his father had caused and the ongoing fight to prevent similar atrocities. Jake's journey was about choosing his own path rather than being defined by his father's sins. The BSAA's transformation into an organization willing to use bioweapon soldiers represented a moral crisis. Chris Redfield's disillusionment showed that even the best intentions could be corrupted over time. The argument for using bioweapons to fight bioweapons had a certain logic, but it ignored the fundamental problem that created the crisis in the first place. Bioweapons were inherently dangerous and difficult to control. Every organization that believed they could master this technology eventually lost control, creating new disasters. Chris's decision to work outside the BSAA showed his commitment to principles over organization loyalty. The fight against bioterrorism required not just military action but also ethical clarity. As long as anyone believed bioweapons could be safely used, the threat would continue. The proliferation of bioweapon technology meant that future conflicts would almost certainly involve biological warfare. The question was not if another outbreak would occur, but when and where. Each incident was followed by promises of better prevention, stronger regulations, and international cooperation, but these promises were rarely kept. Economic interests, national security concerns, and simple greed ensured that bioweapon research continued in secret. The Resident Evil saga is ultimately a story about humanity's relationship with science, power, and responsibility. The scientists who created the T-virus and other bioweapons believed they were advancing human knowledge and capability. They told themselves that the potential benefits justified the risks and the suffering inflicted on test subjects. This rationalization is not unique to fiction. Throughout real history, scientific progress has often come at the cost of human suffering, and researchers have justified terrible actions in the name of discovery. The Umbrella Corporation represented corporate evil, the pursuit of profit without moral constraints. Spencer and others saw people as resources to be exploited, as test subjects and consumers, but never as individuals deserving dignity and rights. This dehumanization allowed them to commit atrocities without guilt. The lesson is clear: when profit becomes the only measure of value, when success is measured solely by wealth and power, humanity loses its way. The bioweapons themselves are metaphors for technology run amok, for creations that escape their creators' control and threaten everyone indiscriminately. The heroes of Resident Evil are ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Chris and Claire Redfield were not initially special. They were people who chose to fight when they could have fled, who took responsibility when they could have looked away. Leon Kennedy was a rookie cop on his first day who faced an apocalypse and decided to help others rather than save himself. Jill Valentine was a skilled officer who refused to accept cover-ups and corruption. These characters became heroes through their choices and their refusal to give up. Their persistence in the face of horror showed that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The emotional toll on these characters was significant. They carried trauma, survivor's guilt, and the weight of countless deaths. They lost friends and loved ones. Their lives were defined by fighting monsters, leaving little room for normal relationships or personal happiness. Yet they continued because someone had to stand against the darkness. Their sacrifice ensured that millions of others could live safely, even if those people never knew the danger they had been protected from. The villains of Resident Evil are complex and varied. Spencer wanted to play God, to control evolution and create a new world order with himself at the top. Wesker believed in forced evolution through survival of the fittest, viewing most of humanity as inferior. Birkin was consumed by his research, valuing his scientific achievements more than human life. Miranda was driven by grief and the inability to accept loss. Each villain had motivations that made sense from their perspective, twisted though they were. This complexity makes them more interesting and more disturbing than simple monsters. They represent different types of evil: ambition, hubris, obsession, and desperate grief. The tragedy is that many of these individuals were brilliant and capable. If they had channeled their abilities toward helping people rather than dominating or transforming them, they could have done immense good. Instead, they became architects of nightmares, their legacies measured in death and suffering. The corrupting influence of power and the dangers of unchecked ambition are central themes throughout the saga. The survivors of bioterrorism incidents faced challenges that extended far beyond physical danger. The psychological impact of seeing loved ones transformed into monsters, of being hunted by creatures that were once human, of making life-and-death decisions in impossible circumstances, left permanent scars. Many survivors developed PTSD, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and intense anxiety. Communities affected by outbreaks never fully recovered. Raccoon City was completely destroyed, its population killed or scattered. Other locations suffered similar fates. The economic impact was enormous, with affected regions becoming contaminated zones that could not be safely inhabited. The stigma associated with infection meant that survivors faced discrimination and isolation. People feared them, worried they might still carry the virus. This fear was not entirely irrational given the nature of bioweapon infections, but it added cruelty to the suffering survivors had already endured. Organizations like TerraSave worked to combat this stigma and provide support, but changing public perception was difficult. The international response to bioterrorism evolved over time, but always struggled with competing interests and lack of cooperation. Nations were reluctant to share information about bioweapon incidents, fearing economic damage and loss of prestige. This secrecy made it harder to track the spread of viruses and respond effectively to outbreaks. The BSAA was created to provide a coordinated international response, but its effectiveness was limited by politics and funding. Some nations saw the BSAA as an infringement on sovereignty, while others tried to use it to advance their own interests. The dream of a unified global response to bioterrorism remained largely unfulfilled. Individual heroes like Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire made significant differences through their actions, but systemic change was slow. The bioweapon threat was too profitable, too useful as a weapon, and too scientifically interesting for humanity to simply abandon the research. Every attempt to ban bioweapon development was undermined by nations and organizations that continued research in secret. As decades passed since the original Mansion incident, the world had changed but the threat remained. New viruses were developed with increasingly sophisticated properties. The T virus was joined by the G virus, Las Plagas, Ouroboros, the C virus, and the mold, each with unique characteristics and dangers. Scientists built on previous research, creating more complex and harder-to-combat bioweapons. The evolution of bioweapon technology meant that responses had to constantly adapt. Vaccines and treatments that worked for early viruses were ineffective against newer variants. The arms race between bioweapon developers and those fighting bioterrorism had no clear winner. Each side adapted to the other's innovations, creating an endless cycle of threat and response. Young people grew up in a world where bioterrorism was a known danger, taught emergency procedures for outbreaks in school alongside fire drills. The normalization of this threat was disturbing, showing how humanity can adapt to even the most terrible circumstances. Cities implemented biohazard response plans. Governments stockpiled vaccines and antiviral medications. Specialized military units trained specifically for bioweapon scenarios. These preparations were necessary but also represented acceptance that bioterrorism was a permanent feature of modern life. Rosemary Winters represented the next generation, someone born into this world rather than thrust into it. Her unique biology, the mold infection that was part of her from birth, made her both a potential victim and a potential solution. Governments and organizations saw Rose as valuable, wanting to study her and use her abilities. Rose herself struggled with being treated as a resource rather than a person, echoing Sherry Birkin's experiences years earlier. The question of what Rose would become, whether she would follow in her father's footsteps or forge a new path, remained open. Her story showed that the impact of bioterrorism extended across generations, that the children of survivors inherited both trauma and responsibility. Rose had powers that could help fight bioweapons, but she also deserved a normal life. Finding balance between these competing needs was a challenge without easy answers. The older generation of heroes, Chris and others, wanted to protect Rose and give her choices they never had. But they also recognized that her abilities might be necessary to stop future threats. The moral questions raised by Resident Evil resonate beyond fiction. In the real world, debates about genetic engineering, gain-of-function research, and biological weapons have similar ethical dimensions. Science advances rapidly, often faster than society's ability to establish appropriate ethical guidelines and regulations. The potential benefits of research, such as cures for diseases or enhanced human capabilities, must be weighed against the risks of misuse or accidents. The Resident Evil saga suggests that some research is too dangerous to pursue, that the risks outweigh any potential benefits. The scientists who created the T-virus believed they could control it, that proper containment and security would prevent disasters. They were wrong, and their mistakes cost millions of lives. The lesson is applicable to real-world debates about controversial research. Confidence in our ability to control dangerous technologies is often misplaced. Accidents happen. Security is breached. Well-intentioned research is weaponized. The precautionary principle, the idea that we should be extremely careful with potentially catastrophic technologies, seems wise in light of the disasters depicted in Resident Evil. Corporate responsibility is another major theme. Umbrella Corporation prioritized profit and shareholder value over human life and safety. When problems arose, the company covered them up rather than taking responsibility. This behavior mirrors real-world corporate scandals where companies have hidden dangerous products, suppressed safety concerns, and prioritized short-term profits over long-term consequences. The pharmaceutical industry in particular has faced criticism for pricing, marketing practices, and research ethics. While no real company has created zombies, the underlying attitude of valuing money over people is not fictional. The Resident Evil saga argues that corporations must be held accountable for their actions, that there must be consequences for leadership that causes harm through negligence or malice. The fall of Umbrella showed that even powerful corporations can be brought down when their crimes are exposed. However, the rise of successor companies like Tricell and the Connections showed that destroying one evil corporation does not solve the systemic problems that allowed it to exist. The legacy of Resident Evil extends beyond the narrative to its cultural impact. The franchise revolutionized survival horror as a genre, establishing conventions and expectations that influenced countless other works. The feeling of vulnerability, of being hunted with limited resources, became a hallmark of the genre. The use of environmental storytelling, where players piece together what happened through documents and observation, created rich narratives without extensive cutscenes. The balance between action and horror, between empowerment and helplessness, defined the Resident Evil experience. The characters of Resident Evil became iconic, with Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire recognized even by people who had never played the games. These characters appeared in multiple titles over decades, aging and evolving alongside players. Seeing these heroes grow from young survivors into experienced veterans created emotional investment. When Chris showed signs of burnout and disillusionment in later games, players who had followed his journey for years felt the weight of those experiences. The decision to introduce new characters like Ethan Winters brought fresh perspectives while honoring the established lore. Ethan's ordinariness, his lack of special training or superhuman abilities, made his heroism more relatable. He showed that you did not need to be a super soldier to make a difference, that love and determination could overcome incredible obstacles. The revelation of Ethan's true nature, that he had been dead and reanimated by the mold, recontextualized his entire journey without diminishing his achievements. Ethan was heroic precisely because he kept fighting despite knowing he was dying, that each step forward brought him closer to the end. The villains of Resident Evil are remembered as much as the heroes. Albert Wesker became an iconic antagonist, his betrayal in the first game establishing him as a personal enemy to the protagonists. Wesker's evolution from corrupt corporate officer to superhuman mastermind made him a persistent threat across multiple games. His death in Resident Evil 5 marked the end of an era, closing a storyline that had run for over a decade. Other villains like Nemesis, a tyrant specifically designed to hunt STARS members, became legendary for their relentless pursuit and intimidating presence. The psychological horror of being chased by an enemy you cannot defeat, only evade, created some of the most memorable moments in gaming. Lady Dimitrescu, from the more recent Village game, became a cultural phenomenon due to her distinctive design and personality, showing that Resident Evil could still create new iconic villains decades after its inception. The variety of antagonists, from mindless zombies to brilliant schemers, kept the franchise fresh and unpredictable. The world building in Resident Evil is extensive and detailed, with interconnected storylines spanning decades and multiple continents. The franchise created a coherent fictional universe where events in one game had consequences in others. The destruction of Raccoon City affected characters and politics in subsequent games. Wesker's actions in early titles influenced later storylines. This continuity rewarded longtime fans while creating a barrier for newcomers who might feel lost without extensive background knowledge. The franchise addressed this through remakes and reimaginings that updated early games with modern technology while maintaining core story elements. These remakes introduced new generations to the classic scenarios while giving veterans a reason to revisit familiar locations with fresh perspectives. The decision to remake games rather than simply remaster them showed respect for the source material while acknowledging that gaming standards had evolved. The ongoing nature of the Resident Evil saga reflects the reality that some fights never truly end. As long as humans are capable of greed, ambition, and moral compromise, the threat of bioweapons or similar dangers will persist. The heroes of Resident Evil won individual battles but never achieved final victory. Each game ended with the immediate threat neutralized but the broader problem remaining. This structure reflects life's complexity, where problems rarely have clean, permanent solutions. Real-world issues like terrorism, corporate malfeasance, and unethical research require constant vigilance and repeated effort. The idea that a single heroic action could solve everything is appealing but unrealistic. Resident Evil embraced this complexity, showing heroes who kept fighting not because they could win permanently but because giving up meant allowing evil to triumph. The accumulation of small victories, lives saved and disasters prevented, mattered even if the war continued. The cost of heroism is a recurring theme. Chris Redfield lost friends and colleagues, carried survivor's guilt, and faced burnout after decades of fighting. Jill Valentine was captured, experimented on, and traumatized by years serving Wesker against her will. Leon Kennedy was recruited into government service through coercion and spent his life in danger with little personal freedom. Claire Redfield chose humanitarian work but witnessed suffering she could ease but not eliminate. Ethan Winters sacrificed his life to save his daughter, never getting to see her grow up. These costs were not gratuitous tragedy but honest acknowledgement that fighting monsters, literal or metaphorical, takes a toll. The heroes continued despite these costs because they valued others' lives above their own comfort. Their willingness to bear these burdens so others would not have to is what made them heroic. The franchise never suggested that heroism was easy or that doing the right thing guaranteed a happy ending. The evolution of bioweapon threats mirrored real-world technological advancement. Early games featured relatively simple zombies and mutations, reflecting the era's understanding of genetics and virology. Later games introduced more sophisticated concepts like parasites that could preserve host intelligence, viruses that could rewrite genetic code without killing the host, and fungal organisms that created networked consciousnesses. These developments reflected growing scientific knowledge about biology and genetics. The franchise incorporated real scientific concepts, extrapolating them into fictional extremes. This grounding in actual science made the threats feel more plausible and therefore more frightening. The debate about whether such things could really happen, whether bioweapons like those in Resident Evil were possible, added to the horror. While zombies might be impossible, engineered pathogens that could cause pandemic devastation were very real concerns. The international scope of later Resident Evil games showed how interconnected the modern world is. An outbreak in one location could spread globally within days through air travel and trade. Bioterrorism became an international crisis requiring coordinated response across borders, cultures, and political systems. The challenges of organizing such responses, with different nations having different priorities and capabilities, were depicted realistically. The BSAA's struggles reflected real-world difficulties in international cooperation on security issues. The franchise suggested that overcoming bioterrorism required not just military might but also diplomacy, intelligence sharing, and genuine commitment to prioritizing human life over national interests. These were idealistic goals that the characters pursued even as they faced constant resistance from political realities. The tension between what should happen and what actually happens drove much of the drama in later games. The Resident Evil saga continues to evolve, with new games adding to the canon and exploring different time periods and characters. The franchise has lasted over 25 years, spanning multiple generations of gaming technology and audiences. This longevity is remarkable and speaks to the strength of the core concepts and characters. The idea of fighting bioweapons and corporate evil resonates across time periods and cultures. Each new entry in the franchise must balance honoring established lore with innovation, giving fans what they expect while surprising them with new ideas. This balance is difficult to achieve, and not every game succeeds equally. Some entries are considered classics while others are seen as missteps. However, the overall trajectory has maintained quality and relevance. The decision to periodically return to survival horror roots after action-focused entries showed the developers understood what made the franchise special. Horror requires vulnerability and atmosphere, elements that can be lost when games become too action-oriented. The remakes of early Resident Evil games introduced the franchise to new audiences while giving longtime fans updated experiences. The Resident Evil 2 remake was particularly praised for modernizing the classic game while maintaining its essential identity. The updated graphics, improved controls, and expanded content showed how remakes could be more than simple graphical updates. They could reinterpret the source material through modern game design philosophy while respecting what made the original special. The success of these remakes suggested that classic game design could coexist with modern expectations, that there was value in revisiting and reinterpreting older works rather than only pushing forward with new entries. This approach allowed younger gamers to experience stories that had shaped the franchise without the barrier of outdated controls and graphics. It also gave veterans a reason to revisit familiar scenarios and see how they held up decades later. The multimedia expansion of Resident Evil into films, novels, and other media spread the franchise beyond gaming. While these adaptations varied in quality and faithfulness to the source material, they introduced the concepts and characters to broader audiences. The live-action films in particular, despite taking significant creative liberties with the lore, became commercially successful and helped maintain cultural awareness of the franchise during periods between game releases. Animated films and series that hewed closer to game canon satisfied fans wanting more story content with their favorite characters. The multimedia presence ensured that Resident Evil remained culturally relevant even for people who did not play games. The iconic imagery of zombies, the Umbrella logo, and characters like Leon and Jill became part of broader pop culture. The theme of ordinary people becoming heroes through necessity remains powerful. While Chris and Jill were trained officers, they were not initially prepared for bioweapons. Leon was literally a rookie cop on his first day. Claire was a college student looking for her brother. Ethan was a civilian with no combat training. These ordinary origins made their achievements more impressive and more relatable. The message was that heroism is not reserved for special individuals but is accessible to anyone willing to act when needed. This democratic view of heroism, where courage and determination matter more than superhuman abilities, contrasts with franchises built around chosen ones or super soldiers. Resident Evil suggested that anyone could make a difference if they tried, that the fight against evil was everyone's responsibility. This message resonated with audiences, many of whom saw themselves as ordinary people who might be called upon to do extraordinary things in a crisis. At its core, Resident Evil is about the monsters we create, both literally and figuratively. The zombies and bioweapons are products of human ambition and greed. They do not exist naturally but were created deliberately by people who believed they could control the consequences. This makes them more disturbing than supernatural monsters. We cannot blame fate or evil gods for bioweapons. We can only blame ourselves. The franchise functions as a cautionary tale about unchecked scientific research, corporate power without accountability, and the human tendency to rationalize terrible actions in pursuit of noble-sounding goals. The scientists at Umbrella probably did not see themselves as villains. They likely believed they were advancing human knowledge, defending their nation, or working toward beneficial goals like curing disease or enhancing human capability. The road to hell being paved with good intentions is a cliché because it is true. Most evil is not committed by people who identify as villains but by those who believe their ends justify their means. The survivors of Resident Evil carry forward the memory of those who died. Every mission undertaken by Chris, Jill, Leon, or Claire is motivated by remembering Raccoon City and other tragedies. They fight so others will not experience what they endured. This forward-looking grief, where loss motivates action to prevent future loss, is a mature response to trauma. Rather than being paralyzed by pain or consumed by revenge, the heroes channel their experiences into protection and prevention. This transformation of suffering into purpose gives meaning to their pain and honors those who did not survive. The memorials, both literal and figurative, that appear throughout the franchise serve as reminders of the stakes. These are not abstract battles but struggles that cost real lives. Every victory is measured not just in enemies defeated but in innocent people saved. The question of whether humanity can change, whether we can learn from catastrophes and avoid repeating them, hovers over the entire franchise. The answer appears to be complicated. Individuals can change and learn. Chris, Jill, Leon, and others are profoundly shaped by their experiences and dedicate their lives to preventing similar tragedies. However, humanity as a collective seems to repeat the same mistakes. New organizations arise to replace Umbrella. New scientists pursue bioweapon research despite knowing the dangers. New politicians prioritize power and profit over human welfare. This pessimistic view suggests that while individuals can be heroic, systemic change is incredibly difficult. The structures that allowed Umbrella to exist, the capitalism that prioritizes profit, the nationalism that drives weapons development, the hubris that believes we can control nature, these forces persist. Fighting individual manifestations of these problems, specific corporations or scientists, achieves tactical victories but does not solve the underlying issues. Yet the franchise also offers hope. The dedication of heroes who refuse to give up, even when victory seems impossible, inspires others. Each person saved potentially becomes someone who will stand against evil in the future. Rose Winters inherited not just her father's biology, but his courage and compassion. The children of survivors grow up understanding the cost of indifference and the importance of resistance. Change happens slowly, through accumulated small actions rather than single dramatic moments. The network of individuals and organizations fighting bioterrorism, from the BSAA to TerraSave to independent operators like Ada Wong, represents a diffuse but persistent opposition to bioweapon proliferation. As long as people are willing to fight, hope remains. The franchise suggests that eternal vigilance is the price of safety, that we can never fully defeat evil but must continuously resist it. This is a sobering message but also a realistic one. The Resident Evil franchise shows no signs of ending. New games are in development, exploring different time periods and introducing new characters while maintaining connections to established lore. The flexibility of the franchise, its ability to tell different types of stories within the broader universe, ensures longevity. A game can focus on survival horror in a confined space or action-packed combat across multiple locations. It can star established heroes or introduce new protagonists. It can explore the early days of Umbrella or the far-reaching consequences of bioterrorism decades later. This variety prevents stagnation and allows the franchise to adapt to changing audience preferences and gaming technology. The core elements remain consistent: bioweapon threats, corporate or governmental malfeasance, survival against overwhelming odds, and heroes fighting to protect others. These elements can be combined in endless variations. The community of Resident Evil fans has grown into a global phenomenon. Players share strategies, theories about lore, and personal connections to characters. Fan content including art, stories, and videos expands the universe beyond official releases. The passion of the community keeps the franchise alive between game releases and provides feedback that shapes future development. Developers have shown willingness to listen to fan feedback, bringing back classic characters, returning to survival horror roots, and remaking beloved entries. This dialogue between creators and community strengthens the franchise and ensures it remains relevant. The debates within the community about which games are best, which characters are most interesting, and where the franchise should go next reflect genuine investment in these stories and characters. Resident Evil has influenced gaming broadly, with many franchises adopting elements it pioneered. The fixed camera angles and tank controls of early games were widely imitated before technological advancement made them obsolete. The concept of survival horror as a distinct genre was largely defined by Resident Evil. The balance between resource management and combat, the importance of environmental storytelling, and the effectiveness of sound design in creating atmosphere all became standard elements of horror games after Resident Evil demonstrated their power. Even games outside the horror genre incorporated Resident Evil-inspired elements like limited ammunition creating tension or unlockable content rewarding exploration. The franchise's influence extends beyond direct imitation to shaping player expectations about what horror games can be. The future of Resident Evil will likely continue exploring the themes that have defined it from the beginning. As long as stories can be told about fighting monsters, corporate evil, and the cost of heroism, the franchise has material. New threats will emerge, new heroes will rise, and the cycle will continue. The question of whether humanity can ever truly overcome the bioweapon threat or will remain locked in endless conflict provides dramatic tension that can sustain countless stories. The personal journeys of characters, their growth and struggles, offer emotional depth that prevents the franchise from becoming repetitive despite retreading similar thematic ground. Each character brings unique perspectives and motivations to the fight, making their stories distinct even when facing similar threats. The story of Resident Evil is ultimately about facing fear and refusing to surrender to darkness. From the moment Stars entered that mansion in the Arkley Mountains to Rose Winters accepting her unique identity, the franchise has celebrated courage in the face of horror. The zombies and bioweapons are terrifying, but what truly defines Resident Evil is how characters respond to that terror. They could flee, hide, or prioritize their own survival above all else. Instead, they fight, they protect others, and they sacrifice themselves when necessary. This consistent theme of heroism elevates Resident Evil above simple monster stories. The franchise asks what we owe to each other, how far we should go to protect innocent lives, and whether fighting impossible odds is worthwhile even when victory seems unattainable. The answer given through countless games and stories is yes. Fighting matters even when winning is uncertain because the alternative is allowing evil to go unopposed. The personal cost paid by heroes throughout the franchise is staggering. Lost friends, physical injuries, psychological trauma, and years spent in danger define the lives of characters like Chris, Jill, Leon, and Claire. They have given up normal lives, relationships, and peace to fight an enemy that keeps changing forms. Yet when asked if they would make different choices, these characters consistently reaffirm their commitment to the fight. They know what happens when no one stands against bioweapons and corporate evil. They have seen the mass graves, the destroyed cities, and the countless innocent victims. They carry those memories forward as motivation and as responsibility. Their continued fight, even after decades, even after so much loss, testifies to the strength of human compassion and determination. These are not superhuman paragons but ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. The legacy of everyone who fought against Umbrella and its successors is measured not just in battles won but in lives saved and futures protected. Every outbreak contained prevented exponential spread that could have killed millions. Every virus sample destroyed was one less weapon available to terrorists. Every corporation exposed and shut down was one less entity profiting from human suffering. The work was never finished and never would be, but progress was real. The world was safer because heroes chose to fight rather than flee. This incremental improvement, the gradual building of defenses and awareness, represented hope. It suggested that while humanity might never eliminate the bioweapon threat entirely, we could manage it, contain outbreaks, and punish those responsible. The dream of a world where bioterrorism was unthinkable might be impossible, but a world where it was rare and quickly defeated was achievable through persistent effort. The story of Resident Evil teaches us about resilience, about continuing to stand after being knocked down repeatedly. It teaches us about sacrifice, about putting others before ourselves when the stakes are high. It teaches us about corporate accountability, about demanding responsibility from those with power. It teaches us about the dangers of unchecked scientific research and the importance of ethical boundaries. Most importantly, it teaches us about hope, about refusing to accept defeat even when circumstances seem hopeless. These lessons resonate beyond gaming and fiction. They apply to real-world challenges, from pandemic response to corporate regulation to personal adversity. The story reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they find courage and purpose. That legacy, the inspiration to stand against darkness regardless of the odds, is what makes Resident Evil more than entertainment. It becomes a myth for the modern age, a story that helps us understand ourselves and the world we inhabit. The journey from that first mansion in the Arkley Mountains to Rose Winters accepting her identity spans decades of story, countless characters, and multiple generations. It encompasses tragedy and triumph, loss and redemption, failure and perseverance. Through it all, the core message remains consistent. Never stop fighting for what matters, never accept evil as inevitable, and never underestimate the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences. The horror of Resident Evil is real and visceral, but the hope it offers is equally powerful. As long as people are willing to stand against monsters, both literal and figurative, humanity has a chance. As long as we remember those who fell and honor them by continuing the fight, their sacrifices mean something. As long as we refuse to give up, fear does not win. This is the entire story of Resident Evil, a tale of biohazard and horror explained softly but powerfully, a saga that reminds us who we can be when darkness falls. The story continues, the fight goes on, and heroes new and old stand ready to face whatever nightmare comes next. Because someone must, and because they choose to care. That choice, repeated across thousands of moments and dozens of characters, is what transforms horror into hope and survival into heroism. The umbrella may cast a shadow, but those who fight back bring light. That is the legacy, that is the meaning, and that is why the story of Resident Evil will endure.